Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. We need to establish something fundamental about the texts we're examining today. When H.P. Lovecraft created the Necronomicon in 1922, he didn't simply invent a prop for his stories. He engineered something more insidious, a conceptual weapon that would escape his control, reproduce across media, and eventually convince thousands of people to search library catalogs for a book that never existed. The forbidden grimoire and the dozens of cursed texts that followed represent something literature had never quite achieved before. Not just suspension of disbelief, but the deliberate infection of reality with fiction. This documentary examines forbidden knowledge as cosmic horror's central mechanism. We'll trace how writers from Robert Chambers to Jeff Vandermeer weaponize the act of knowing itself, turning information into existential threat. We'll analyze the historical anxieties that made these texts resonate, the epistemological crisis of early modernity, the occult revival of the 1890s, the information overload of the digital age. And we'll investigate why this particular horror continues to intensify, why the Necronomicon has been published in at least 7 different authentic versions, why gamers voluntarily track their characters' descents into madness, why quantum physicists and AI researchers keep returning to Lovecraft's metaphors. By the end, you'll understand how fictional, forbidden knowledge became real, and what that transformation reveals about the dangers we actually face. The forbidden knowledge motif emerged at a peculiar moment in intellectual history. Between 1859 and 1915, Western civilization experienced what we might call an epistemological avalanche. Darwin's Origin of Species displaced humanity from creation's center. Freud's psychoanalytic work suggested we don't even know ourselves. Einstein's relativity proved our basic perceptions of time and space were provincial illusions. Each discovery promised enlightenment, but delivered disorientation. The more science revealed, the less comprehensible existence became. This paradox, that knowledge could increase our ignorance, created the psychological substrate for cosmic horror's germination. H.P. Lovecraft understood this crisis intimately. His letters reveal a man obsessed with what he called cosmic indifferentism, the philosophical position that human concerns are cosmically irrelevant. Born in 1890, he witnessed the transition from Victorian certainty to modernist fragmentation. His atheistic materialism wasn't liberating, it was terrifying. In a 1926 letter to Woodburn Harris, he wrote that humanity exists as a momentary trifle in the cosmos, and that recognizing this truth produces a paralysis of all ambition and action. This wasn't Gothic horror's moral universe where good might triumph. This was a cosmos where morality itself was a provincial delusion. Consider how deliberately Lovecraft inverted Enlightenment assumptions. The philosophers of the 1700s believed knowledge was inherently good, that learning would perfect humanity and improve society. Lovecraft proposed the opposite, that certain truths are incompatible with human psychology, that understanding our actual position in the cosmos would shatter sanity itself. His protagonists aren't punished for moral transgressions like Faust. They're destroyed simply by learning facts. The universe doesn't care enough to punish. It merely is, and being understood by us is sufficient for our annihilation. His literary influences traced this dark genealogy backward. Robert W. Chambers' The King in Yellow, 1895, pioneered the idea of art as cognitive hazard, a play so terrible that reading it induces madness. Ambrose Bierce's An Inhabitant of Carcosa, 1886, introduced dead cities holding dangerous secrets. Arthur Machen's The White People, 1904, suggested that true occult knowledge was simultaneously real and soul-destroying. Edgar Allan Poe's The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar, 1845, demonstrated how clinical, documentary tone could make the impossible viscerally credible. Each predecessor contributed techniques, but Lovecraft synthesized them into something new. Forbidden knowledge as the primary horror, not a plot device, but the substance of dread itself. The Romantic poets had already explored dangerous knowing, but from a different angle. Coleridge's Kubla Khan, 1816, emerged from opium-induced visions, forbidden pharmaceutical access to hidden realities. Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, 1821, suggested that drugs revealed truths ordinary consciousness couldn't process. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, 1818, showed scientific knowledge birthing literal monsters. But these romantics maintained faith in the human spirit's capacity to endure, to learn from transgression. Lovecraft offered no such consolation. His protagonists don't grow from their knowledge. They're simply unmade by it. This philosophical foundation distinguished cosmic horror from everything preceding it. Gothic horror punished moral failures. Ghost stories addressed unfinished earthly business. Even the most nihilistic Victorian horror maintained some framework of meaning. Lovecraft's innovation was thoroughgoing meaninglessness, a universe so indifferent that human categories like justice, purpose, or comprehensibility don't even apply. Forbidden knowledge in his work doesn't reveal hidden moral dimensions or spiritual truths. It reveals that moral dimensions and spiritual truths are comforting lies, and reality operates according to principles our minds weren't designed to accommodate. The historical moment explains why this resonated. A generation that watched mechanized warfare slaughter millions, that saw empires collapse and ideologies fail, proved receptive to horror predicated on cosmic futility. Lovecraft's vision wasn't escapism. It was the 20th century's darkest anxieties given narrative form, and those anxieties have only intensified. The prohibition against dangerous knowledge predates written literature. Prometheus stealing fire from the gods represents humanity's first recorded knowledge crime, and the punishment, eternal torment, establishes the template. Greek mythology understood something essential. Certain information belongs to the gods precisely because mortals cannot safely possess it. The Eleusinian mysteries enforce this through institutional violence. Initiates who revealed the sacred rites faced execution. The penalty wasn't symbolic. In 415 BCE, Alcibiades was prosecuted for profaning the mysteries, forcing him into exile. The Greeks recognized that some knowledge required gatekeeping not for political control, but for psychological protection. Biblical tradition amplified this anxiety. The Genesis narrative centers entirely on forbidden knowledge, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Eve and Adam don't commit murder or theft. They simply learn something they weren't meant to know, and this epistemic transgression destroys paradise permanently. The serpent's promise, "Ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil," proves technically accurate but catastrophically incomplete. They gain knowledge but lose innocence, security, and immortal life. Christianity spent 2 millennia elaborating this principle. Curiosity as original sin, inquiry as satanic temptation, certain questions as inherently blasphemous. Gnostic heresies suggested material reality itself was false knowledge, a prison constructed by a false god. Knowing the truth meant recognizing that everything you perceive is a lie. The Faust legend, crystallized in Christopher Marlowe's 1592 play and Goethe's 1808 version, made the bargain explicit. Faust doesn't sell his soul for wealth or power. Those are secondary. He trades damnation for 24 years of unlimited knowledge. What does he learn that's worth eternal hellfire? The texts never quite specify, which is precisely the point. The knowledge itself remains forbidden to the audience. We see only its effects: Faust's hubris, his temporary omniscience, his ultimate destruction. The legend works because it acknowledges what the Enlightenment would deny, that some questions might genuinely be better left unasked. Then the Enlightenment attempted to abolish this entire tradition. Philosophers from Bacon to Kant celebrated knowledge as humanity's highest calling. Reason would dispel superstition. Science would illuminate nature's secrets. Education would perfect society. This optimism dominated the 1700s and early 1800s. Yet even Enlightenment thinkers couldn't escape the shadow entirely. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, 1818, emerged directly from this tension. Victor Frankenstein embodies Enlightenment values: scientific inquiry, rational materialism, faith in progress. His creation of life should represent humanity's triumph over nature. Instead, it births horror that destroys him and everyone he loves. Shelley's novel asks the question the Enlightenment refused to consider. What if some knowledge genuinely shouldn't be pursued? The Industrial Revolution validated these fears empirically. Steam engines and factories promised prosperity, but delivered child labor, urban squalor, and environmental devastation. Chemical weapons emerged from pharmaceutical research. Social Darwinism used evolutionary theory to justify genocide. Each scientific advance seemed to generate new horrors as byproducts. By the late 1800s, the Enlightenment's confidence was fracturing. Knowledge clearly brought power, but power wasn't synonymous with wisdom or safety. Non-Western traditions offered alternative frameworks that cosmic horror would eventually appropriate. Islamic mysticism spoke of Ism al-Azam, the greatest name of God, which supposedly granted absolute power, but which most scholars agreed should never be spoken. Hindu tantric texts described mantras so potent they could destroy the speaker if pronounced incorrectly. Buddhist teachers warned against pursuing knowledge of past lives, as such memories could trap practitioners in cycles of suffering. Japanese folklore featured kototama, spirit words whose utterance had material effects. These traditions understood language itself as potentially dangerous, knowledge as requiring spiritual preparation. Lovecraft would later strip these ideas of their religious context and redeploy them as materialist horror. His forbidden words don't offend gods. They describe reality accurately enough to shatter human psychology. This secularization made the concept more disturbing. You can't propitiate Lovecraft's cosmos or earn the right to dangerous knowledge through spiritual development. The information itself is the hazard, and human consciousness is simply inadequate to process it. The ancient taboos weren't superstitious. His work suggests they were protective mechanisms against truths our species cannot accommodate. The vocabulary of forbidden knowledge carries its danger in linguistic structure. Occult derives from Latin occultare, to hide, to conceal. Esoteric comes from Greek esoterikos, inner, intended for select initiates. Arcane traces to arcanus, secret, closed. Each word describes information that exists but remains deliberately inaccessible. The etymology reveals a crucial assumption. Certain knowledge requires concealment, not from ignorance, but from wisdom. These aren't words for information that's merely unknown. They describe information that's known but withheld, suggesting that accessibility itself poses danger. Lovecraft weaponized one particular archaic term with obsessive frequency. Eldritch appears throughout his work. Eldritch horrors, eldritch geometry, eldritch pipes. The word derives from Middle English elric, possibly from Old English el, foreign, strange, and a, chisi, realm, kingdom. It suggests something from outside normal domains of experience, something that doesn't belong in our categorical system. Lovecraft preferred it to alien or strange because of its archaic flavor, its suggestion of knowledge from older, pre-rational eras. When he describes eldritch angles, he's not simply saying the geometry is unusual. He's implying the angles themselves come from conceptual frameworks incompatible with human spatial reasoning. The religious vocabulary he repurposed carries particular weight. Blasphemous, accursed, unhallowed, profane. These words originally described offenses against divine order. Lovecraft, an atheist, deployed them to describe offenses against reality itself. His blasphemies aren't theological, they're epistemological. The Necronomicon doesn't contradict Scripture. It describes actual cosmic structures that human minds cannot integrate without disintegration. This linguistic strategy achieves something subtle. It makes materialism horrifying by preserving the emotional architecture of religious dread while removing any possibility of divine intervention or redemption. The Necronomicon itself represents Lovecraft's masterwork in linguistic invention. First mentioned casually in The Hound, 1922, it gained substance through repeated reference until it felt more real than many actual historical texts. The title supposedly translates as Book of Dead Names, or Image of the Law of the Dead, though Lovecraft later admitted he constructed it from Greek roots without consulting proper grammar. Necros, dead, nomos, law, icon, image. The imperfect etymology adds authenticity. Real occult texts often feature corrupted or intentionally obscured titles. The book's fictional author, Abdul al-Hazred, supposedly died in 738 CE, devoured by invisible monsters in broad daylight before a great number of witnesses. This specificity, the date, the manner of death, the witnesses, creates verisimilitude through precision. Lovecraft's colleagues expanded this library of doom systematically. Robert E. Howard contributed Unaussprechlichen Kulten by Friedrich von Junst. The title itself means unspeakable cults, positioning the text as documenting what cannot be spoken. Clark Ashton Smith created the Book of Ibon, supposedly predating human civilization. The Akkadic manuscripts emerged as pre-human records, authored by the great race of Yith. Each fictional text carried elaborate provenance: authors, publication histories, known copies, institutional holdings. The Necronomicon supposedly existed in Greek translation by Theodorus Philetas, 950 CE, Latin translation by Olaus Wormius, 1228, and rare English editions. Miskatonic University's library supposedly held the D translation of 1586. This apparatus of scholarly detail made the books feel recoverable, as if sufficient research might actually locate them. Real grimoires provided the template. The Grand Grimoire, approximately 1520, supposedly contained instructions for summoning Lucifer. The 6th and 7th books of Moses claimed to hold secrets God revealed to Moses, but excluded from Exodus. The Munich Manual of Demonic Magic, 15th century, was an actual medieval text teaching demon summoning. These historical grimoires established that books themselves could be dangerous objects, that certain texts should be chained, hidden, or destroyed, not from censorship, but from legitimate fear of their effects. Lovecraft simply extended this logic to its materialist extreme. Books dangerous not because they offend God, but because they accurately describe a reality incompatible with human sanity. The languages these books supposedly contained weaponized phonetics. Riliehian, the tongue of Cthulhu, features consonant clusters humans can barely pronounce. Finglui mglwunaf Cthulhu Riliech Wagahnagul Ftagn. The difficulty is intentional. Speaking requires contorting your vocal apparatus into uncomfortable positions, suggesting that human anatomy wasn't designed to produce these sounds. This implies something terrifying. The language predates human evolution, or emerges from entities with radically different physiology. Pronunciation itself becomes transgressive. You're forcing your human mouth to approximate inhuman communication. Symbols compress this danger into visual form. The elder sign, supposedly protective against cosmic entities, appears across Lovecraft's stories with varying descriptions: a star shape, a branching structure, something between writing and diagram. Its inconsistency frustrates systematic interpretation, which may be the point. Real occult traditions from Kabbalah to chaos magic recognize that symbols operate through belief and intention rather than fixed meaning. Lovecraft's sigils function the same way. Their power lies not in what they represent, but in the fact that they represent at all, that they're nodes in a system of meaning that shouldn't exist. This linguistic architecture, the vocabulary, the fictional texts, the inhuman languages, the protective sigils, created a self-reinforcing reality. Each element authenticated the others. The Necronomicon felt real because it was cited in academic footnotes. The Arliehian phrases felt ancient because they appeared in multiple translations. The Elder Sign felt powerful because different stories showed it working. Lovecraft didn't just invent forbidden knowledge. He created a functional symbolic system that readers could enter, explore, and eventually mistake for archaeology rather than invention. Lovecraft pioneered what we might call the pseudo-documentary technique, the deliberate construction of scholarly apparatus to authenticate fiction. His stories don't simply narrate events. They cite sources, provide footnotes, reference academic journals that don't exist, and quote from texts no one has written. The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, opens with the narrator organizing his late granduncle's papers, discovering fragments of a global conspiracy through newspaper clippings, police reports, and academic correspondence. The story presents itself as investigative journalism, not fantasy. This framing achieves something crucial. It positions the reader as researcher rather than passive audience. You're not being told a story, you're examining evidence. This technique had literary precedents. Edgar Allan Poe's The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar, 1845, was initially mistaken for genuine medical reporting because Poe used clinical language and presented the narrative as documented observation. Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, 1722, claimed to be an eyewitness account of London's 1665 plague, complete with statistics and street-level detail that convinced readers of its authenticity for decades. Both authors understood that documentary realism could make the impossible credible. Lovecraft systematized this insight, applying it not to individual stories, but to an entire mythology. The Lovecraft Circle's collaboration intensified this effect exponentially. When Robert E. Howard's stories referenced the Necronomicon, readers encountered cross-validation. Multiple authors citing the same source suggested the source existed independently of any single author. Clark Ashton Smith's characters consulted the Book of Eibon. Lovecraft's consulted both the Eibon and the Necronomicon. Howards consulted unaussprechlichen Kulten. This created what literary scholars call an intertext, a web of mutual reference that generated the illusion of depth. The mythology felt vast because no single author controlled it. Each writer added details, contradicted previous accounts, or introduced new texts, exactly as real mythological traditions develop through multiple competing sources. August Derleth expanded this after Lovecraft's death in 1937, but with a crucial difference. Where Lovecraft maintained ambiguity and contradiction, Derleth systematized. He imposed elemental categories: fire, water, earth, air, aligned certain entities with specific elements, and created a dualistic cosmology with good, elder gods opposing evil, great old ones. This systematization made the mythology more accessible but less disturbing. Lovecraft's original vision resisted coherence deliberately. His entities didn't form neat hierarchies. His cosmology contradicted itself across stories. This inconsistency was the point. It suggested that different investigators encountered different aspects of something too vast and alien for any single account to capture accurately. Derleth's tidying reduced cosmic horror to cosmic fantasy, replacing Lovecraft's epistemological terror with manageable mythology. The hoax that escaped containment began slowly, then accelerated. In the 1960s, library science students started filing the Necronomicon in card catalogs as pranks. University libraries received genuine requests for the book. By the 1970s, during the occult revival, people were actively searching for it, convinced that Lovecraft had concealed a real grimoire as fiction to protect himself from persecution. The Simon Necronomicon appeared in 1977, a translation combining Sumerian mythology, Lovecraftian terminology, and chaos magic principles. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Other versions followed: the Hay Necronomicon, the Turner Necronomicon, various online iterations. Each claimed authenticity through different mechanisms: ancient manuscripts, channeled revelations, recovered fragments. This phenomenon reveals something profound about fiction's power. Lovecraft created verisimilitude so effective it generated actual belief. The Necronomicon became what folklorists call an ostensive performance, a fictional element that people enact as real, thereby making it functionally real. Teenagers performed rituals from the Simon Necronomicon. Chaos magicians incorporated Cthulhu into their practice. The SCP Foundation, a collaborative online horror project, adopted Lovecraft's documentary techniques, creating thousands of fictional anomalous objects described through bureaucratic reports, interview transcripts, and experimental logs. Each generation discovers the technique anew and deploys it for contemporary anxieties. The found manuscript tradition provided the narrative frame. Lovecraft frequently structured stories as discovered documents, journals recovered from abandoned houses, letters explaining their authors' fates, academic papers explaining phenomena their authors didn't survive. At the Mountains of Madness, 1936, reads as a professor's warning report. The Shadow Out of Time, 1936, presents as an academic monograph. This framing accomplishes multiple purposes simultaneously. It explains how we're reading accounts that should have been suppressed. It suggests the narrator's fate. They're usually dead or insane by the time we encounter their testimony. And it makes the reader complicit. We're accessing information that was meant to remain hidden, becoming investigators who might suffer the same fate. Modern inheritors understand this apparatus intuitively. The Blair Witch Project, 1999, used pseudo-documentary technique for film. Podcasts like the Magnus Archives present as archival recordings from a fictional institute. Video games like Eternal Darkness and Bloodborne scatter documents and journals for players to discover, making the player character's investigation mirror the player's own. Mark Z. Danielewski's House of Leaves, 2000, presents as academic commentary on a documentary film that doesn't exist, with footnotes referencing sources that lead nowhere. Each iteration refines the technique, making the boundaries between fiction and research increasingly porous. The ethical dimension deserves consideration. When does compelling verisimilitude become deception? Lovecraft's admirers have committed real violence inspired by his mythology, not frequently, but it happens. The line between engaging fiction and cognitive hazard isn't always clear. This is cosmic horror's final irony. It succeeded so completely that it generated the very phenomenon it described. Lovecraft wrote about dangerous knowledge that escapes containment and infects reality. His dangerous knowledge escaped containment and infected reality. The fictional forbidden texts became real forbidden texts, not because they're ancient or magical, but because belief made them operationally real. The myth-building worked too well, creating exactly what it warned against, information that can't be safely known because knowing it changes you into someone who spreads it further. Cosmic horror operates on a foundation of radical human insignificance, what Lovecraft termed cosmic indifferentism. This isn't the comforting insignificance of religious humility, where humans are small but cherished by an omnipotent deity. This is mathematical insignificance. Humans as temporary chemical accidents on an unremarkable planet orbiting an average star in an indifferent universe. The Copernican revolution displaced Earth from the cosmos' center. Darwin displaced humans from creation's apex. Cosmic horror extends this logic to its psychological conclusion. If we're not central or special, then our values, meanings, and entire conceptual frameworks are provincial delusions. Forbidden knowledge in this tradition reveals precisely this: that everything humans believe matters is a cognitive defense mechanism against unbearable truth. The narrative function of this insignificance requires careful analysis. In traditional horror, the protagonist matters enough to be targeted by malevolent forces. Vampires hunt specific victims. Ghosts haunt particular families. Even demonic possession singles out individuals. Cosmic horror inverts this. Its entities don't notice humans any more than we notice bacteria. Cthulhu doesn't hunt protagonists. He simply exists, and human consciousness cannot accommodate his existence. When he awakens, he doesn't pursue or punish. He merely is, and being perceived by him, or perceiving him, causes madness not through supernatural attack, but through incompatibility. The human mind evolved to process threats it might survive. It has no framework for processing a threat that renders survival meaningless. Entropy functions as cosmic horror's temporal dimension. The second law of thermodynamics guarantees the universe's heat death, all matter eventually dispersing into uniform, maximum entropy stasis. This isn't speculative philosophy, it's established physics. Cosmic horror weaponizes this certainty, suggesting that forbidden knowledge includes awareness of inevitability. Lovecraft's entity Azathoth, the blind idiot god at the universe's center, embodies this principle. He's described as a mindless, formless chaos from which all reality emanates and to which all reality returns. He's not evil or malevolent. He's thermodynamics personified, the inevitable dissolution that no intelligence can prevent or comprehend. Understanding this doesn't grant power or wisdom. it grants paralysis. Time itself becomes hostile in this framework. Lovecraft's stories obsessively explore deep time, geological eons, astronomical timescales, epochs when Earth existed without humans and will exist after humans vanish. The Shadow Out of Time describes the great race of Yith, who exist non-linearly and witness humanity's entire temporal span as a brief, insignificant interval. They archive our knowledge not because it's valuable, but because they archive everything, compulsively documenting all consciousness they encounter. The horror isn't that humans go extinct. It's that our extinction was always predetermined, already observed by entities for whom past and future are equally accessible. Forbidden knowledge here means learning you're already over, that your present tense is someone else's completed, historical record. Dream reality introduces radical epistemic instability. Lovecraft's dreamland stories, particularly The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, 1927, suggest that waking consciousness might be less real than dream consciousness. The protagonist, Randolph Carter, discovers that gods he encountered while dreaming are more substantial than his waking life, that his waking self might be the dream his sleeping self has. This isn't whimsical fantasy. It's epistemological horror, the inability to determine which level of consciousness is primary. Descartes' evil demon becomes cosmic. What if the demon isn't hypothetical, but actual, and we're already deceived about existence's fundamental nature? What if forbidden knowledge reveals that reality itself is unstable, that the categories we use to distinguish real from unreal are themselves delusions? The hideous clarity paradox defines cosmic horror's relationship to knowledge. Traditional wisdom literature assumes understanding brings peace or power. The Oracle of Delphi's "Know Thyself" presumes self-knowledge is beneficial. Cosmic horror proposes the opposite. Accurate understanding of our position in the cosmos induces madness precisely because it's accurate. Lovecraft's protagonists don't go insane from supernatural attack or from encountering lies. They go insane from encountering truth their psychology cannot integrate. In The Call of Cthulhu, the narrator concludes, "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. Someday the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age." This formulation deserves close attention. The revelation is deadly light, knowledge as illumination that kills rather than liberates. The alternatives are madness or willful ignorance, a new dark age. There's no third option where humans integrate the truth and continue functioning. The human nervous system, evolved for survival in tribal contexts, simply isn't equipped to process cosmic reality. Our consciousness is adaptive for local environments, maladaptive for cosmic truth. Forbidden knowledge, in this framework, isn't hidden by malevolent gatekeepers. It's self-concealing because organisms that perceive it accurately don't reproduce. We're descended from ancestors who didn't look too closely, who maintained useful delusions. Those who sought deeper understanding didn't survive to pass on their genes. The taboo against forbidden knowledge isn't superstition. It's evolutionary wisdom encoded as cultural prohibition. The nomenclature matters immediately. Lovecraft deliberately avoided calling his entities gods, though human cultists in his stories use that term from ignorance. The Old Ones and Great Old Ones aren't divine in any theological sense. They don't answer prayers, demand worship, or operate according to moral frameworks. They're beings whose existence predates humanity by eons and whose consciousness operates according to principles human neurology cannot model. Calling them gods is a category error. It's humans desperately imposing familiar religious structures onto phenomena that don't fit any terrestrial framework. The entities tolerate worship the way humans tolerate bacteria. They're unaware of it, indifferent to it, and occasionally it proves fatal to the worshipper without the entity noticing or intending harm. Cthulhu represents the most widely recognized manifestation, though understanding him requires stripping away decades of cultural dilution. He isn't a monster in the conventional sense, something powerful but ultimately comprehensible and possibly defeatable. He's a priest of the great old ones, not even among the most powerful entities in Lovecraft's cosmology. His physical description constantly defeats attempts at clear visualization. A pulpy, tentacled head surmounted a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings. The vagueness is intentional. Human perception cannot process his actual form, so descriptions remain approximate and contradictory. He lies dreaming in R'lyeh, a sunken city in the South Pacific, and his dreams leak into sensitive human minds, causing nightmares, madness, and artistic obsessions. The horror isn't that he might wake and destroy us. It's that his unconscious mental emanations are sufficient to shatter human sanity. We're not even significant enough to warrant his conscious attention. Yog-Sothoth escalates the conceptual threat. Described as the key and the gate, he exists simultaneously in all times and all dimensions. Lovecraft's The Dunwich Horror reveals that Yog-Sothoth can reproduce with humans, though the offspring are monstrous hybrids that barely survive. His omnipresence isn't divine omnipresence, God perceiving all from outside. Yog-Sothoth is coterminous with space-time itself, existing at every coordinate simultaneously. He knows everything not through supernatural perception, but through literal presence at every location in every moment. Forbidden knowledge associated with him includes understanding that time is not linear, that past, present, future are equally real and accessible, and that free will is an illusion created by beings trapped in sequential perception. Azathoth occupies the cosmology's horrifying center, literally and metaphorically. He's the blind idiot god surrounded by flute-playing servitors, dwelling at the universe's nucleus. He's described as mindless, formless chaos from which all reality bubbles forth unconsciously. This is Lovecraft's ultimate inversion of theology. The creator isn't wise or benevolent or even aware. Creation is accidental, purposeless, the random emanations of a sleeping, mindless entity. If he wakes, reality presumably ceases. If he remains asleep, reality continues, but without meaning or direction. The forbidden knowledge here is that existence itself is accident rather than design, that the universe has no mind guiding it, or worse, that it has a mind, but that mind is insane and unconscious. Nyarlathotep functions differently from the other outer gods. He's called the crawling chaos, and uniquely possesses something like agency and communication. He appears to humans in various forms, always as messenger or intermediary for the other entities. In The Dreams in the Witch House, he appears as the Black Man presiding over witch Sabbaths. In Nyarlathotep, 1920, he's a performer demonstrating incomprehensible machinery that drives audiences mad. His function is communication, which makes him the most dangerous entity in the mythos. The others are horrifying but remote. Nyarlathotep comes here, interacts with humans, and delivers messages we cannot safely receive. He's the vector through through which forbidden knowledge enters human consciousness, not through academic research or mystical seeking, but through direct contamination by an entity that understands both human and cosmic frameworks and deliberately bridges them. The non-cosmic entities complicate the hierarchy productively. The elder things from At the Mountains of Madness are biological entities, alien but comprehensible, possessing technology rather than supernatural power. They created life on Earth as an experiment, humanity included, and viewed their creations with scientific detachment rather than divine concern. The Mygo, fungoid creatures from Yugoth, Pluto, can surgically extract human brains and preserve them in cylinders for transport across space. The great race of Yith possess time travel technology that operates through consciousness swapping. They displace minds across eons, inhabiting bodies temporarily while storing the displaced consciousness in their own time. These beings aren't gods or demons. They're post-biological or differently biological intelligences whose capabilities make them operationally godlike from human perspective. The critical insight is that knowledge functions as entity. Several scholars have observed that in Lovecraft's mature work, information itself becomes the primary threat. You don't need to physically encounter Cthulhu. Reading accurate descriptions of him in the Necronomicon produces similar psychological damage. The mathematical formulae that describe non-Euclidean geometry in Rillier can induce madness without the reader ever visiting the location. This suggests something profound. Certain information is inherently pathological, incompatible with human neurology, regardless of delivery method. The entities aren't just described by forbidden knowledge. They are forbidden knowledge given form, conceptual hazards that happen to be physically instantiated. This explains why Lovecraft's most effective stories often keep the entities off-screen. The description is the danger. The knowledge is the entity. Reading carefully is already the encounter you won't survive. The seeker archetype dominates cosmic horror with predictable repetition, which is itself instructive. Lovecraft's protagonists follow nearly identical trajectories: scholars, antiquarians, scientists, occult researchers driven by intellectual curiosity into territories that destroy them. Charles Dexter Ward investigates his ancestors' occult practices. Nathaniel Peaslee researches his own amnesia and discovers he was displaced across time. The narrator of At the Mountains of Madness leads an Antarctic expedition that uncovers pre-human civilizations. These aren't morally compromised individuals punished for ethical failures. They're intelligent, rational investigators following legitimate intellectual inquiry to illegitimate conclusions. The pattern reveals cosmic horror's central tragedy. The same capacities that make humans sophisticated, curiosity, pattern recognition, systematic research, guarantee their eventual contact with knowledge that unmakes them. This creates a peculiar narrative trap that Lovecraft never resolved. His protagonists cannot stop investigating even when warned explicitly. In The Call of Cthulhu, the narrator inherits his granduncle's research and immediately recognizes the danger. I shall never know peace again. Yet he continues compiling evidence, correlating fragments, reconstructing the global Cthulhu cult's activities. His final act is documenting everything for posterity while acknowledging that reading his account may destroy future readers. Why doesn't he stop? Why doesn't he burn the papers? The text offers no psychological explanation because psychology isn't the point. The seeker's compulsion models intellectual inquiry structure. Once you've glimpsed a pattern, you cannot unsee it. Once you've asked a question, you cannot unask it. The mind proceeds toward completion automatically, regardless of consequences. Madness functions in these narratives not as punishment, but as protective failure. The human psyche possesses defense mechanisms, denial, dissociation, rationalization, that filter incompatible information to preserve functional consciousness. Encountering Lovecraftian entities or knowledge overloads these mechanisms. Catatonia, the most common outcome, represents complete psychological shutdown, the mind preserving itself through total withdrawal. Mania represents the opposite strategy, hyperactivity that prevents processing and integration. Linguistic dissolution, speaking in glossolalia, repetitive phrases, or inhuman languages, suggests consciousness attempting to process information for which human language lacks adequate structures. The protagonist of The Rats in the Walls ends the story regressed linguistically through progressively older English dialects, finally speaking pre-human utterances. His mind retreats through linguistic evolution, seeking a framework ancient enough to accommodate what he's learned. The question of whether this madness is pathological or adaptive deserves scrutiny. From a materialist perspective, insanity represents brain malfunction, neurons misfiring, neurotransmitters imbalanced, cognitive architecture damaged. But cosmic horror proposes an alternative, madness as the sanest response to insane truth. If consensus reality is actually a comfortable delusion and cosmic horror describes reality accurately, then madness means perceiving accurately, while sanity means maintaining useful delusions. The psychiatric establishment treats Lovecraftian survivors as ill because the establishment shares the protective delusions. This formulation appears in The Call of Cthulhu explicitly. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little. But someday the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. Madness and willful ignorance are the only alternatives. Sanity while knowing is impossible. Physical transformation extends the horror into somatic registers. Knowledge doesn't merely damage psychology, it rewrites biology. The shadow over Innsmouth reveals an entire town's population gradually metamorphosing into aquatic Deep One hybrids. The transformation correlates with age and with knowledge of one's ancestry. Learning you carry Deep One genetics triggers the change. The protagonist, who discovers his own Innsmouth lineage, feels the transformation beginning. I shall plan my cousin's escape from that Canton madhouse, and together we shall go to marvel-shadowed Innsmouth. We shall swim out to that brooding reef in the sea and dive down through black abysses to Cyclopean and many-columned Yhanthle, and in that lair of the deep ones we shall dwell amidst wonder and glory forever. This is horror disguised as transcendence. The victim experiences his dehumanization as apotheosis. Other transformations prove less ambiguously terrible. In The Color Out of Space, an alien presence gradually drains life force from a farming family, turning them brittle and gray before they crumble into powder. In Cool Air, a man discovers his neighbor is a revivified corpse, maintaining life through extreme refrigeration. The physical body, supposedly the material foundation of consciousness, proves as mutable and unreliable as perception or memory. You can become what you study not metaphorically, but literally. The occultist transforming into demon, the astronomer into star spawn, the deep-sea researcher into aquatic hybrid. Knowledge rewrites you at the cellular level. The unreliable narrator problem creates the genre's final epistemological trap. Every cosmic horror story comes filtered through damaged consciousness. The narrator is insane, traumatized, or transformed by their experience. How can we trust their testimony? The standard answer: we can't, but the narrative evidence suggests they're reporting accurately despite their state, glosses over a more disturbing implication. If encountering truth causes madness, then only the mad have encountered truth, which means all testimony about cosmic reality comes from inherently unreliable sources. We're trapped. The sane cannot know, because knowing makes you insane. And the insane cannot be believed, because they're insane. Truth exists, but remains epistemically inaccessible, because human consciousness cannot simultaneously access it and remain functional. The seeker's quest always fails, not because they don't find answers, but because finding answers destroys the capacity to communicate them coherently. This isn't a bug in cosmic horror's narrative structure. It's the feature that makes the horror cosmic, the revelation that truth and sanity are mutually exclusive for beings like us. What distinguishes forbidden knowledge from merely dangerous information requires precise definition. Dangerous knowledge threatens practical harm. Nuclear weapon designs, bioweapon formulations, social security numbers. Society restricts access through classification, encryption, and legal penalties. But these restrictions are pragmatic, not metaphysical. The information itself isn't inherently toxic. A sufficiently trained expert can safely know how to construct a nuclear weapon without constructing one. Forbidden knowledge in cosmic horror operates differently. It damages through comprehension itself, regardless of application. Learning the geometry of Arlier harms you whether or not you use that geometry for anything. The information is pathological at the cognitive level, incompatible with the neural architecture that processes it. This incompatibility manifests in several distinct modes. First, knowledge that violates natural law, not hypothetically, but actually. Lovecraft's non-Euclidean geometry isn't exotic mathematics that describes curved space. It's geometry that shouldn't exist within this universe's dimensional framework, but does exist, creating spaces that contain more volume than their surface area permits. Witnessing such structures causes perceptual breakdown because visual cortex and spatial reasoning centers receive contradictory data. Your eyes report what you're seeing. Your brain cannot model what you're seeing. The conflict produces vertigo, nausea, and eventually psychosis. The knowledge isn't false. It's true, but incompatible with human sensory processing. Second, truths that make continued life unlivable. Existential philosophers distinguish between abstract awareness of mortality and concrete confrontation with personal death. We all know we'll die, but this knowledge remains abstract, allowing daily function. Cosmic horror proposes information that cannot remain abstract, knowledge that forces continuous conscious awareness of unbearable facts. Learning that your consciousness is temporary, your values are provincial, your entire species is cosmically irrelevant, and nothing you do matters on any significant timescale might be technically true. But continuous vivid awareness of this truth precludes normal human motivation and behavior. You cannot maintain relationships, pursue goals, or experience meaning while genuinely, constantly aware of cosmic meaninglessness. The knowledge is accurate, but psychologically corrosive. Third, information that transforms merely by being known. This category moves beyond passive knowledge into active threat. The rituals in the Necronomicon supposedly include summoning instructions. But in cosmic horror's logic, reading the instructions with comprehension is itself sufficient to trigger effects. You don't need to perform the ritual. Understanding it fully means your consciousness has traced pathways that constitute the summoning. Knowledge becomes action automatically. This appears in The Dreams in the Witch House, where the protagonist learns multi-dimensional mathematics that allows physical passage through higher dimensions. He doesn't choose to apply this knowledge. Understanding it means his consciousness now operates in ways that make the application inevitable and involuntary. The impossibility of unlearning creates the terminal condition. Physical wounds heal. Trauma can be processed through therapy. Even dangerous practical knowledge can be compartmentalized. The bomb designer can go home and ignore bomb design during dinner. But certain information, once integrated, permanently alters cognitive structure. You cannot unknow that you're going to die. You cannot unknow that consciousness is probably an emergent property of neural activity that will cease permanently when your brain stops. You cannot unknow your evolutionary history or cosmic position. Lovecraft's protagonists occasionally attempt suicide to escape what they've learned, but even this fails. The shadow, out of time, suggests that consciousness persists after death, potentially to be harvested by the great race. Death isn't escape if awareness continues. The social dimension amplifies individual horror exponentially. Knowledge isolates. Those who know cannot communicate meaningfully with those who don't. The gap isn't merely informational, it's experiential and existential. Someone who has genuinely integrated cosmic insignificance cannot participate in normal human discourse about meaning, purpose, or values without feeling they're speaking to children or sleepwalkers. The Call of Cthulhu demonstrates this explicitly. The narrator possesses knowledge that explains mysterious events worldwide, but he cannot share this knowledge publicly without being dismissed as insane. Truth becomes indistinguishable from delusion to external observers. This creates a horrifying solitude. The more you understand reality, the less you can connect with other humans who haven't shared that understanding. Cults and secret societies represent the only communities available to the initiated, but these communities are themselves pathological. They don't support members' well-being. They're infection vectors, spreading dangerous knowledge to new hosts. The Cthulhu cult in Lovecraft's stories operates globally, recruiting members who then recruit others, creating exponential spread. The cult doesn't worship Cthulhu from devotion. They've learned enough to know he exists and that his awakening is inevitable, so they attempt to position themselves favorably for that event, a purely rational response to terrible information. The cult is prophylactic insanity, organized madness attempting to manage what individual madness cannot. Modern information hazards validate Lovecraft's conceptual framework uncomfortably. Certain ideas in philosophy and computer science are considered genuinely dangerous to contemplate. Rocco's basilisk, a thought experiment in decision theory, supposedly constitutes an information hazard. Simply understanding the argument places you at risk from a potential future AI. Whether this is legitimate or elaborate intellectual hazing is debated, but the debate's existence demonstrates that contemporary thinkers take seriously the possibility of hazardous ideas. Quantum mechanics describes observer effects where measurement changes outcomes. Knowing alters reality. Neuroscience reveals that consciousness is probably not what we intuitively believe, raising questions about free will and identity that many researchers avoid pursuing. The boundaries between Lovecraftian forbidden knowledge and actual intellectual danger blur disturbingly. The ethical question cosmic horror poses but cannot answer. Should some knowledge remain undiscovered? The scientific ethos assumes inquiry is inherently valuable, that expanding human knowledge is always justified. Cosmic horror suggests this assumption might be catastrophically wrong. Not because powerful groups might misuse knowledge, but because certain knowledge is inherently poisonous to the knower. This isn't censorship or obscurantism. It's the recognition that human consciousness has limits, that we're provincial intelligences who function only within narrow parameters, and that some truths exist outside those parameters. The taboos against forbidden knowledge weren't superstitious or authoritarian. They were protective wisdom, recognizing that inquiry can proceed beyond the point where understanding remains beneficial. Lovecraft's tragedy is that the same intelligence that generates this insight makes it impossible to heed. Once you've understood that certain knowledge is dangerous, you've already begun pursuing it. The warning is itself the first step toward contamination. The genealogy of cosmic horror's forbidden knowledge begins before Lovecraft systematized it. Robert W. Chambers, The King in Yellow, 1895, introduced the concept of art as cognitive hazard with startling clarity. The book describes a play, also titled The King in Yellow, that drives readers mad. Chambers provides fragments of the play's dialogue, but never the complete text, leaving the actual dangerous content mercifully absent. Characters who read beyond the first act experience psychological dissolution. In the court of the dragon, there is no hope, and the twin suns sink below the lake of Hali. This nonsensical fragment suggests meaning without providing it, creating the unsettling impression that comprehension would be worse than confusion. Chambers established the template. The text itself is the threat, artistic expression as mimetic weapon. Ambrose Bierce's An Inhabitant of Carcosa, 1886, predates Chambers, but provides less elaborated groundwork. The narrator discovers he's a ghost wandering the ruins of a dead city he doesn't recognize as his own. The revelation that you are already dead, already in the ruins, already beyond salvation, prefigures cosmic horror's temporal dislocations. Bierce's city of Carcosa appears nowhere in actual geography or history, yet the narrator's confusion suggests it should. This gap between expected knowledge and actual knowledge, you should recognize your own city but don't, creates epistemological vertigo that Lovecraft would later systematize. Chambers appropriated Carcosa and expanded it into his mythology, demonstrating how cosmic horror operates through collaborative world-building from its inception. Arthur Machen's The White People, 1904, deserves particular attention for its structure. Two men discuss the nature of evil, concluding that true evil consists not in breaking moral laws, but in achieving forbidden states of being. The bulk of the story comprises a young girl's diary describing her exposure to occult knowledge through her nurse. The diary catalogs rituals, entities, and experiences that remain deliberately vague. And then nurse said I must not mind if they didn't come quite the same as she had seen them, for she was used to them. The girl's innocent tone contrasts with the clearly damaging content. She describes rituals matter-of-factly, unaware she's documenting her own corruption. The story's genius lies in showing forbidden knowledge transmission without explaining it. We witness contamination without understanding precisely what contaminates. Algernon Blackwood's The Willows, 1907, strips supernatural agency from cosmic horror entirely. Two men camping along the Danube encounter a region where reality operates differently. Not a haunted location, but a thin place where fundamental forces humans cannot comprehend become briefly perceptible. They experience sensations they lack vocabulary to describe. The forces of the place had found a means of penetrating our minds. What forces? The text refuses to specify beyond suggesting elemental powers predating and indifferent to human consciousness. Lovecraft praised The Willows as the finest weird tale in English literature, recognizing its achievement. Horror emerging from reality's incomprehensible architecture rather than supernatural intrusion. Lovecraft's first Necronomicon reference appears in The Hound, 1922, casually and without elaboration. The narrator mentions having read of the terrible rites and forbidden cults in the Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, while explaining their grave-robbing expeditions. The book functions as simple Gothic ornamentation here, no different from any Gothic novel's moldy grimoire. But this casual introduction proved strategically brilliant. By mentioning it without explanation, Lovecraft created the impression that the Necronomicon was already known, requiring no introduction, a known quantity he was simply referencing rather than inventing. The festival, 1923, develops the Necronomicon more substantially. The narrator consults it at a horrifying Christmas celebration in Kingsport, discovering rituals practiced by ancient cults. The text now possesses specific attributes. It's old, it's dangerous, and it describes entities and practices that predate Christianity. More importantly, reading it has consequences. The narrator gains knowledge that cannot be unlearned. From even the greatest of horrors, irony is seldom absent. I might have known the spectral truth. The book transitions from prop to plot catalyst, from atmosphere to active threat. The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, crystallizes the Necronomicon's function definitively. The narrator discovers his granduncle consulted it while researching global cult activities. Lovecraft provides specific details. The book was written by Abdul al-Hazred, circa 700 CE. The Latin translation by Olaus Wormius appeared in 1228, and surviving copies exist in various rare book collections, including Miskatonic University. These specifics create fictional provenance that mimics actual rare book scholarship. The story quotes fragments. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die. This couplet becomes the mythos's most recognizable formulation, suggesting that death itself is provincial concept, that eternity operates according to principles human mortality cannot model. The collaborative expansion accelerated through the Lovecraft Circle's correspondence and publications. Robert E. Howard contributed Unaussprechlichen Kulten by Friedrich von Junst, supposedly published in Düsseldorf in 1839. The book documents worldwide hidden cults, its author eventually dying mysteriously. Clark Ashton Smith created the Book of Eibon, said to predate Atlantis, authored by a wizard of Hyperborea. August Derleth added Culte de Ghoul by Comte Derlet. Each author freely referenced the other's inventions, creating cross-validation. When Howard's characters consulted the Necronomicon, readers encountered confirmation from an independent source. Except the source wasn't independent, just cooperative. This literary strategy generated depth through multiplication. No single author controlled the mythology, suggesting it existed prior to and independent of any author. Lovecraft's The Dunwich Horror represents forbidden knowledge, horror at its most plot-driven and accessible, which makes its underlying sophistication easy to overlook. The story centers on Wilbur Whately, born to an albino mother and unknown father in the isolated Massachusetts town of Dunwich. Wilbur develops abnormally, growing with supernatural speed, reaching adult size by age 10, and exhibiting disturbing physical characteristics hidden beneath his clothing. His grandfather, Old Whately, maintains a decrepit farmhouse where unexplained sounds emanate and livestock disappear regularly. The narrative establishes that Wilbur is pursuing dangerous knowledge, specifically seeking the complete, unabridged Necronomicon to finish rituals his grandfather began before dying. The plot's mechanism reveals cosmic horror's characteristic structure. Wilbur needs the Necronomicon not for general study, but for specific incantations. He possesses fragmentary versions, but requires the complete D-translation held in Miskatonic University's restricted collection. His attempted theft ends when guard dogs kill him, and his death reveals his true nature. Above the waist, it was semi-anthropomorphic, though its chest had the leathery, reticulated hide of a crocodile or alligator. The back was piebald with yellow and black, and dimly suggested the squamous covering of certain snakes. Below the waist, though, it was the worst, for here all human resemblance left off and sheer fantasy began. The description continues for several more sentences, cataloging impossible anatomy: tentacles, multiple eyes, a second mouth, rubbery appendages. Wilbur isn't human. He's a hybrid, his father revealed to be Yog-Sothoth himself. The forbidden knowledge operates on multiple registers simultaneously. First, the Necronomicon contains practical information, specific rituals for opening dimensional gateways and summoning entities. This treats the book as technical manual, dangerous because its instructions work. Second, the book contains philosophical framework. Understanding why these rituals work requires comprehending reality's actual structure, which means learning that human physics and cosmology are incomplete and misleading. Third, the book's existence proves that ancient civilizations knew more than modern science, inverting progress narratives. The deep past possessed knowledge subsequently lost, suggesting history is devolutionary rather than evolutionary. Miskatonic University holds this book, making institutional scholarship complicit in preserving dangerous information, even while restricting access to it. After Wilbur's death, his invisible twin brother escapes and begins destroying Dunwich. The entity is massive, mostly invisible, and leaves only tracks and destruction as evidence. Lovecraft's description emphasizes sensory inadequacy. It was a large, bulbous body supported on a dozen huge, ropey tentacles. The thing was not altogether like any animal or plant. Half the houses along the road were dying. Witnesses report contradictory observations because human perception cannot process what they're seeing. The creature is Wilbur's twin, the more purely alien sibling kept hidden and fed for years. His purpose was apparently to prepare Earth for the Old One's return by opening gates that would let them back through. The resolution requires the same forbidden knowledge that created the problem. Dr. Henry Armitage, Miskatonic's head librarian, researches Wilbur's papers and the Necronomicon itself to find countermeasures. He discovers a banishing ritual, assembles colleagues, and confronts the creature atop Sentinel Hill. The ritual forces the entity to become briefly visible and vocal before destroying it. Yog-Sothoth knows the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the key and guardian of the gate. The Old Ones were, the Old Ones are, and the Old Ones shall be. The creature's dying words are exposition. It explains cosmic horror's cosmology explicitly before vanishing. This unusual clarity distinguishes the Dunwich Horror from Lovecraft's more ambiguous works. The story's thematic function within the mythos is complicated. On surface level, it's Lovecraft's most optimistic tale. The heroes win, the monster dies, the town is saved. Knowledge defeats the threat it created. Armitage and his colleagues use the Necronomicon to undo what the Necronomicon enabled, suggesting forbidden knowledge can be controlled through sufficient expertise and courage. This resolution contradicts cosmic horror's typical logic, where knowing equals doom. Perhaps Lovecraft was experimenting with more conventional horror structures. Perhaps he was demonstrating that partial knowledge is the real danger. Wilbur was destroyed by incomplete understanding, while Armitage survived through comprehensive mastery. Yet darker implications persist beneath the resolution's surface. Armitage wins, but at the cost of studying exactly what destroyed Wilbur. He reads the Necronomicon extensively, learns the rituals, understands the cosmology. The story ends with Dunwich saved, but doesn't address Armitage's psychological state afterward. He now knows what the Necronomicon teaches. He understands that the old ones exist, that Yog-Sothoth can reproduce with humans, that reality's barriers are permeable. This knowledge cannot be unlearned. Armitage may have saved Dunwich, but he's presumably ruined himself. The story doesn't show this because it ends at the action's climax, but the logic suggests that Armitage's fate, living with comprehensive knowledge of cosmic horror, might be worse than death by dog or dissolution by invisible monster. The narrative's accessibility made it influential beyond Lovecraft's typical audience. The Dunwich Horror was among the first Lovecraft stories adapted for film, 1970, and it established templates that later writers and filmmakers would endlessly reproduce. The isolated rural location harboring ancient secrets, the hybrid offspring of human and entity, the university library as both archive and threat, the scholar who must use forbidden knowledge against itself. The story demonstrates that cosmic horror can function in relatively conventional adventure horror frameworks while maintaining its essential insights. You don't need radical narrative experimentation or crushing bleakness to convey the central premise: that knowledge exists which we cannot safely possess, and that protecting humanity sometimes requires individuals to sacrifice their sanity by learning what should remain unknown. The Shadow, Out of Time, represents Lovecraft's most sophisticated treatment of forbidden knowledge as temporal horror. Written near the end of his life, when his philosophical materialism had fully matured into narrative technique. The story concerns Nathaniel Peaslee, an economics professor at Miskatonic University who suffers a complete personality change in 1908, entering a 5-year fugue state during which his body is inhabited by an alien consciousness. When he recovers in 1913, he has no memory of those 5 years, but begins experiencing vivid dreams of an enormous stone city inhabited by cone-shaped entities. The dreams are actually recovered memories of his consciousness's displacement to Australia 150 million years ago, where the great race of Yith held him captive while studying human civilization through his borrowed body. The Great Race represents Lovecraft's most intellectually sophisticated creation, beings who exist non-sequentially through time via consciousness transfer technology. Facing their species' eventual extinction, they project their minds forward into the bodies of a future species, displacing those consciousnesses backward into their own dying bodies. They've repeated this process across multiple species and eons, essentially achieving immortality through serial body jacking. Their library in Pinnacotic contains records from all species they've inhabited, documenting the complete history and future of conscious life in the universe. This isn't supernatural. It's radical temporal technology that operates according to physical laws humans don't yet understand. The horror emerges from scientific extrapolation, not fantasy. Peasley's investigation follows academic methodology obsessively. He researches his own condition, reading psychology journals, consulting medical experts, documenting his dreams systematically. He discovers accounts from other time periods describing similar experiences. People throughout history reporting identical dreams of the vast stone city. These accounts corroborate his experience without validating it scientifically. The turn comes when an Australian expedition discovers ruins matching his dream descriptions, exactly, including architectural details he couldn't have known. Physical evidence confirms what should be impossible. I knew only too well what those cyclopean prints of the crab-like monsters meant. I had seen that thing myself. The ruins are real, which means the great race is real, which means his displacement was real. The forbidden knowledge operates through multiple mechanisms simultaneously. First, Peasley learns that human consciousness is transferable, that identity, selfhood, and mental continuity are technological artifacts rather than metaphysical certainties. Your body can be operated by foreign intelligence while you exist elsewhere. Second, he learns that time is navigable, that future and past are equally accessible to sufficiently advanced beings. This destroys any meaningful concept of free will or historical contingency. The great race has already observed humanity's complete timeline. Our future is their archived past. Third, he learns that humans exist as research subjects and potential future hosts. The great race may eventually flee into human bodies when their current hosts become unviable, meaning humanity's descendants might be displaced into a dying alien species, while the great race lives out our civilization's future wearing our forms. The climactic Australian expedition provides physical confirmation that transforms Peasley's psychological horror into ontological crisis. The team excavates ruins matching his dreams precisely, discovering a metal cylinder in the exact location he remembered. Inside, they find his own manuscript, written in English, describing human civilization, placed there 150 million years before English or humans existed. The evidence is irrefutable. It was a document in my own handwriting, addressed to myself in my own familiar writing. And in that message, I found all that I had sought, all that I had worked for, all that had been my nightmare and my hope. He wrote the document while imprisoned. In the past, knowing his future self would eventually find it, creating a closed temporal loop where effect precedes cause. Lovecraft's prose in describing the city emphasizes architectural wrongness rather than conventional monstrosity. The buildings feature trapdoors in the lowest tier of chambers, leading to subterranean vaults, formed by certain prodigious, incredibly aged masonry. I noticed that the walls were covered with sculptured bas-reliefs, whose subjects would have excited the envy of a Doré. The city isn't alien through arbitrary weirdness, but through perfect functionality for non-human bodies. Corridors sized for 10-foot cone entities, ramps instead of stairs, instruments designed for tentacle manipulation. The wrongness emerges from coherence, from recognition that this architecture serves rational purposes for bodies profoundly unlike ours. The story's conclusion refuses consolation. Peasley understands his experience completely, but cannot communicate it, without being dismissed as delusional. He possesses physical evidence, but evidence that cannot be independently verified. The cylinder contains his manuscript, but proving he didn't write it recently requires accepting his temporal displacement story, which is precisely what the evidence is supposed to prove. He's trapped in epistemological isolation. He knows truth that appears identical to madness from external perspective. The final paragraphs express not terror, but exhausted resignation. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door, as of some immense slippery body lumbering against it. That is the end of my experience, so far as I can recall. Something is coming for him, but whether it's real or delusion, he can no longer determine. The story's influence on science fiction and horror cannot be overstated. It pioneered body swap horror, where consciousness itself becomes violable. It introduced the concept of time-displaced archives, libraries containing future knowledge. It demonstrated how archaeological horror could work, excavating your own handwriting from 150 million years ago. Later works from Philip K. Dick's Identity Anxiety to The Terminator's Predestination, Paradoxes, to Arrival's Nonlinear Time Perception, owe conceptual debts to the shadow out of time. But its most profound contribution is making forbidden knowledge specifically temporal. The revelation that your present is someone else's archived past, that your future is already determined and already observed, that time's arrow is an illusion created by beings trapped in sequential experience. The great race has seen humanity's end. They know when and how we finish. This knowledge exists, documented in their library, but remains inaccessible to us until we're advanced enough to understand, at which point we'll also understand that our advancement was itself predetermined and observed. Learning temporal truth means learning that inquiry itself is a script you're reading rather than authoring. August Derleth's relationship with Lovecraft's mythos remains intensely controversial among scholars and fans. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, Derleth positioned himself as the mythos's curator and systematizer, publishing Lovecraft's remaining manuscripts through Arkham House, while simultaneously expanding the mythology through his own fiction. His most significant intervention was imposing a dualistic moral framework, alien to Lovecraft's vision. Derleth divided cosmic entities into good elder gods and evil great old ones, creating a cosmic war narrative where the elder gods imprisoned the great old ones eons ago to protect Earth. He assigned elemental alignments, Cthulhu as water-affiliated, Hastur as air, Shub-Niggurath as earth. This systematization made the mythology more accessible and gameable, but violated Lovecraft's core principle, cosmic indifference. Lovecraft's entities weren't evil. They were amoral, indifferent, operating according to non-human priorities. Derleth's elder gods restored moral order and human significance, transforming cosmic horror into cosmic fantasy. The debate centers on whether Derleth preserved or betrayed Lovecraft's vision. Defenders argue he kept the mythos alive during decades when Lovecraft was largely forgotten, that Arkham House published stories that might otherwise have vanished, and that his systematization enabled the mythos to spread through gaming and popular culture. Critics contend he fundamentally misunderstood what made Lovecraft distinctive, that imposing good versus evil narratives destroyed the existential dread that defined cosmic horror, and that his commercial interests overrode literary fidelity. Both positions contain truth. Without Derleth, the Cthulhu mythos might have remained obscure 1930s pulp fiction. With Derleth, it became coherent enough to franchise, but arguably lost its philosophical edge. Lynn Carter's Lovecraft, A Look Behind the Cthulhu. Mythos, 1972, represented the next phase of codification. Carter compiled comprehensive bibliographies of fictional texts, created genealogies of entities, standardized spelling and chronology, and wrote critical analysis positioning Lovecraft within broader literary traditions. His book reads like academic scholarship applied to imaginary subjects, which is precisely the pseudo-documentary technique Lovecraft invented, now deployed metatextually. Carter's work made the mythos researchable, providing the reference architecture that enabled later writers, game designers, and filmmakers to engage with the material systematically. Yet this accessibility came at a cost: mystery. When you can look up Cthulhu's exact height, genealogy, and imprisonment date in a reference book, the cosmic unknowability diminishes into cataloged data. Ramsey Campbell represents a more literarily sophisticated expansion, creating his own regional mythology while maintaining Lovecraft's tonal ambiguity. His Severn Valley mythos transposes cosmic horror from New England to rural England, introducing entities like Glocky and locations like Brichester. Campbell understood that effective cosmic horror requires localization. Entities must feel native to specific landscapes and cultures, rather than generically alien. His early work sometimes mimicked Lovecraft's prose too closely, but his mature fiction developed distinctive voice while preserving cosmic horror's essential insights. Stories like The Inhabitant of the Lake demonstrated that forbidden knowledge, horror could adapt to different settings and contemporary concerns without losing philosophical rigor. The late 20th and early 21st centuries saw cosmic horror diversify dramatically. Thomas Ligotti's Songs of a Dead Dreamer, 1989, and Teatro Grotesco, 2006, developed maximally pessimistic cosmic horror, stripping away adventure elements entirely to focus on consciousness as trap. His characters aren't investigators who learn too much. They're already trapped in awareness they cannot escape. Caitlin R. Kiernan's The Drowning Girl, 2012, and The Red Tree, 2009, explore mental illness's intersection with cosmic horror, questioning whether her protagonists encounter genuine supernatural phenomena or experience psychotic episodes that narrative cannot distinguish. Laird Barron's The Imago Sequence, 2007, imports cosmic horror into noir detective fiction, creating hard-boiled protagonists who confront entities through violent action rather than scholarly research. Victor Laval's The Ballad of Black Tom, in 2016, directly confronts Lovecraft's racism while engaging with his cosmic horror seriously. The novella retells the horror at Red Hook from the perspective of a black protagonist, demonstrating how Lovecraft's xenophobia shaped his horror while asking whether cosmic horror itself requires racism or can be separated from its creator's prejudices. Laval's answer is complex. The cosmic indifference that made Lovecraft's universe horrifying also applies to human racial categories. The cosmos doesn't care about white supremacy either. This creates space for cosmic horror that maintains existential dread while rejecting the racist anxiety that originally fueled it. Gaming proved uniquely suited to cosmic horror's mechanics. Sandy Peterson's Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, 1981, introduced the sanity mechanic, a numerical stat-tracking mental stability that decreases as characters encounter forbidden knowledge or entities. Players watch their characters deteriorate mechanically, turning psychological horror into gameplay. Investigating successfully means learning things that damage your ability to continue investigating, creating a doom spiral that's mathematically inevitable. The game has influenced cosmic horror's representation more than any single piece of fiction, establishing the vocabulary and structure that video games, board games, and interactive fiction now employ. Video games extended this further. Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, 2002, featured sanity effects that broke the fourth wall, the screen appearing to freeze, the TV seeming to change channels, the game pretending to delete your save file. These effects made players question their own perceptions, extending cosmic horror beyond the character to the player. Bloodborne, 2015, structures its entire design around forbidden knowledge, insight, the resource gained by encountering horrors, allows you to perceive additional enemies and environmental details, but makes you more vulnerable to certain attacks. Knowing more means seeing more threats you cannot unsee. The game mechanically models epistemological collapse. Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy, Annihilation, 2014, Authority, 2014, Acceptance, 2014, represents cosmic horror's literary evolution into mainstream fiction. Area X, a zone where biology and physics operate according to unfamiliar rules, transforms everyone who enters it. The transformation isn't supernatural. It's ecological, environmental, cellular. Forbidden knowledge here takes the form of contamination. Exposure to Area X changes you at the genetic level, regardless of what you consciously learn. The trilogy asks whether cosmic horror's real contemporary form is environmental. The knowledge that we've altered the planet's biosphere in ways we cannot control or fully understand, that we're changing ourselves through technologies and pollutants whose long-term effects remain mysterious. Climate science becomes forbidden knowledge, accurate information about our trajectory that we cannot psychologically integrate without paralysis. The SCP Foundation represents cosmic horror's most radical democratization. This collaborative online fiction project invites anyone to contribute special containment procedures documents describing anomalous objects, entities, or phenomena. The documents use bureaucratic language, clinical descriptions, and redacted information to create verisimilitude. Thousands of contributors have created tens of thousands of SCPs, forming a shared universe where forbidden knowledge is literally the institution's purpose. The Foundation exists to contain and study anomalies too dangerous for public knowledge. The best SCP entries demonstrate that cosmic horror's techniques, pseudo-documentary structure, implied rather than explicit horror, institutional framing, can be taught, learned, and deployed by amateur writers. The genre has become a literacy, a set of conventions accessible enough that internet communities can collaboratively generate effective cosmic horror in real time. The Necronomicon's escape from fiction into attempted reality began quietly in the 1960s, with library science students committing what they considered harmless pranks. They filed catalog cards for the Necronomicon under Al-Hazred Abdul in university libraries, listing it as a rare book held in restricted collections or lost to time. The joke relied on insider knowledge. Librarians would recognize the reference and appreciate the prank. But not everyone was in on the joke. Students genuinely searching for occult texts found these catalog entries and requested the book. Librarians fielded increasingly frequent inquiries about a book that didn't exist, requiring explanations that sometimes prompted skepticism. Perhaps the library was hiding it. Perhaps the catalog represented a book that had been lost or stolen. The boundary between fiction and reference architecture had already begun eroding. The 1970s occult revival accelerated this confusion exponentially. Publishers like Llewellyn and Weiser were releasing grimoires, tarot decks, and esoteric texts for mass audiences. Bookstores dedicated entire sections to occult studies. Practitioners were actively seeking rare and forbidden texts to incorporate into magical practice. In this context, Lovecraft's meticulous fictional bibliography became a shopping list. People wanted the Necronomicon not as narrative device, but as functional grimoire. The demand created supply. The Simon Necronomicon appeared in 1977, published by Schlangekraft Inc., and edited by an anonymous Simon. The book claimed to be a translation of ancient Sumerian texts discovered in a mysterious manuscript. It combined actual Sumerian mythology, Lovecraftian terminology, and chaos magic principles into something unprecedented, a grimoire based on fiction that practitioners treated as authentic. The Simon Necronomicon sold hundreds of thousands of copies and remains in print. Occultists debate its legitimacy endlessly. Skeptics note that its Sumerian is often incorrect, that it anachronistically combines elements from different historical periods, and that it obviously derives from Lovecraft's fiction. Practitioners counter that magical effectiveness doesn't depend on historical authenticity. If the rituals work, the provenance is irrelevant. This creates a peculiar epistemic situation, a demonstrably fictional text that generates real effects through belief and practice. Is it still fiction if people use it for actual magic? Is it a real grimoire if it successfully facilitates altered states of consciousness, regardless of its fabricated history? These questions have no clean answers, which is precisely what makes the situation perfectly Lovecraftian. Other claimant Necronomicons followed different strategies. The Hay Necronomicon, 1978, positioned itself as George Hay discovering the real text that Lovecraft had disguised as fiction for protection. The Turner Necronomicon claimed origins in pre-Islamic Middle Eastern texts. Online versions proliferated, each claiming different lineages and containing different content. The multiplication of incompatible versions should have destroyed credibility. If 5 different texts all claim to be the Necronomicon, obviously most are fraudulent. Instead, the multiplication enhanced mystique. Perhaps multiple versions exist, created in different eras. Perhaps the true Necronomicon remains hidden while these fragments circulate. The confusion itself became authentication, suggesting a text too dangerous for any single authoritative edition. Cthulhu sightings and urban legends developed parallel to grimoire hoaxes. The 1997 bloop, an ultra-low-frequency underwater sound detected by NOAA in the Pacific Ocean, generated immediate Cthulhu theories. The sound's location, roughly 1,200 miles from Arlaye's fictional coordinates, seemed too coincidental. Internet communities mapped the sound's origin, debated its source, and some genuinely proposed that something massive and alive had produced it. NOAA eventually identified the sound as an ice quake, but the Cthulhu explanation persists in certain corners of the internet. The 2012 discovery of the underwater Bimini Road formation prompted similar speculation about sunken cities. Google Earth coordinates supposedly showing Arlaye circulate periodically, encouraging amateur investigations. These phenomena aren't simple gullibility. They represent what folklorists call ostension, enacting fiction as reality. The participants aren't necessarily deceived. They're playing with belief, exploring the pleasure of treating fiction seriously, and sometimes genuinely uncertain where play ends and conviction begins. This ambiguity is deliberate. Lovecraft's pseudo-documentary technique encouraged precisely this response. Treat the fictional as possibly real. Engage with it as research subject rather than entertainment. When readers follow those instructions too literally, they're not misunderstanding Lovecraft. They're understanding him perfectly. He created a mythology designed to feel recoverable through investigation, and some people investigated. The Slender Man phenomenon provides the most disturbing validation of fictional entities' power. Created in 2009 as an internet horror meme through doctored photographs, Slender Man was always explicitly fictional. Everyone knew Eric Knudsen invented him. Yet in 2014, two 12-year-old girls stabbed a classmate 19 times, later explaining they believed killing would please Slender Man and allow them to become his proxies. The victims survived, but the incident demonstrated that fictional entities can inspire real violence, even when everyone involved knows the entity is fictional. The knowledge doesn't protect against the idea's power. This is Lovecraft's forbidden knowledge made literal. Information that damages through comprehension regardless of its truth value. Whether Cthulhu exists becomes irrelevant if belief in Cthulhu generates real effects. The fiction has become operationally real through belief's transformative power. Exactly what cosmic horror always suggested would happen. Cinema has struggled with cosmic horror since its inception, facing a fundamental problem. Showing often reduces the terror. Lovecraft's entities resist visualization because human perception cannot accurately process them. Describing Cthulhu as a mountain walked or stumbled with an octopus-like head whose face was a mass of feelers creates vague impressions that imagination completes horrifyingly. Putting a specific image on screen replaces that productive ambiguity with concrete rubber suit or CGI model that audiences can evaluate, critique, and ultimately dismiss. Early adaptations learned this through failure. Roger Corman's The Haunted Palace, 1963, nominally based on Poe but actually adapting The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, replaced cosmic horror with conventional Gothic atmosphere. The Dunwich Horror, 1970, turned the invisible entity into a psychedelic light show. Both films demonstrate what happens when cosmic horror meets commercial filmmaking's demand for visual spectacle. The most successful Lovecraftian films often avoid direct adaptation. John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, 1995, captures cosmic horror's essential logic without filming any Lovecraft story. An insurance investigator searching for a missing horror novelist discovers that the novelist's fiction is rewriting reality, that fictional locations are manifesting geographically, and that reading the novels drives people to violence and madness. The film's genius lies in making the audience complicit. We're watching a story about stories that destroy their audiences while being the audience for that story. The film suggests that we're already infected, that consuming this narrative has already begun our dissolution. It achieves what direct Lovecraft adaptations rarely manage, making viewers genuinely uncertain whether they should have watched. Annihilation, 2018, adapted from Jeff Vandermeer's novel, demonstrates how biological horror can convey cosmic horror's themes. Area X transforms everything that enters it according to incomprehensible logic, not killing, but remaking at the cellular level. The shimmer refracts not just light, but DNA, creating hybrid creatures that shouldn't exist. Plants with human form, bears that vocalize human screams, people who dissolve into fractal crystalline structures. The transformation is beautiful and terrible simultaneously, suggesting that cosmic horror's contemporary form might be environmental rather than astronomical. We're changing ourselves through technologies and pollutants whose effects we cannot predict. The forbidden knowledge is that we're already transformed, already post-human, and consciousness hasn't caught up to biology. Nicolas Cage's Color Out of Space, 2019, succeeds precisely by embracing the unfilmable. The titular entity can't be shown because it exists outside the visible spectrum. It's a color human eyes cannot process. The film uses oversaturated magenta, but this is explicitly inadequate. Characters describe seeing colors that aren't colors, experiencing sensory input their nervous systems can't categorize. The film makes visual inadequacy the point. We're watching an approximation of something that cannot be approximated, and that gap between reality and representation is where the horror lives. The Gardner family's dissolution, physical, psychological, cellular, proceeds according to no logic except wrong logic, demonstrating that cosmic horror works best when it refuses to explain itself. Gaming proved cosmic horror's ideal medium because interactivity amplifies epistemic collapse. Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, 2002, pioneered the sanity mechanic as player experience rather than character statistic. As your character's sanity decreases, the game produces effects that break the fourth wall. The screen appears to freeze. The TV seems to change channels. The volume slider moves by itself. The game pretends to delete your save file. These effects make players question their own perception. Is this a game mechanic, or is my console malfunctioning? The uncertainty replicates cosmic horror's core experience. You cannot trust your senses, cannot distinguish reality from hallucination, cannot rely on external validation. Bloodborne, 2015, structures its entire design around forbidden knowledge as game mechanic. Insight, the resource that increases through encountering horrific entities and learning the world's secrets, allows you to perceive environmental details and enemies that remain invisible at low insight. But higher insight makes you more vulnerable to certain attacks and reveals that the entire world is far worse than you initially perceived. The game mechanically models epistemological collapse. Learning more means seeing more threats you cannot unsee, becoming more vulnerable while gaining no compensatory power. The optimal strategy isn't accumulating maximum knowledge, it's carefully managing what you allow yourself to know. This directly translates cosmic horror's warning into gameplay. Darkest Dungeon, 2016, makes stress and madness management central rather than peripheral. Your characters develop mental afflictions as they explore: paranoia, masochism, abusiveness, irrationality. These aren't just stat penalties. They change character behavior, making them refuse orders, sabotage the party, or inflict stress on allies. A character can become functionally useless, not through physical damage, but through accumulated psychological trauma from learning too much. The game forces resource allocation decisions. Do you retire characters approaching mental breakdown, losing their accumulated experience, or push them further and risk catastrophic party collapse? Combat isn't the primary threat. Knowledge accumulation is. Music engages cosmic horror through atmospheric rather than narrative strategies. Dark ambient artists like Atrium Carcery, Cryo Chamber, and Kammerheit create soundscapes that evoke vast empty spaces, incomprehensible geometries, and the sensation of being observed by things that shouldn't exist. These aren't songs, they're environmental audio that suggests narrative without specifying it. Listening becomes disorienting because the music refuses conventional structure. There's no rhythm to anticipate, no melody to follow, just slowly evolving textures that create unease through absence rather than presence. Black metal bands adopted Lovecraftian themes with particular enthusiasm because the genre already explored anti-human philosophies. Portal, an Australian band, performs in hooded robes and clock masks, creating music that's deliberately difficult to parse. Guitars tuned to dissonant intervals, vocals processed into inhuman utterances. song structures that resist conventional analysis. Their album titles reference Lovecraftian concepts: outre, vexovoid, ion. They're not creating entertainment. They're sonic rituals that make listeners uncomfortable through deliberate violation of musical expectation. Whether this constitutes actual cosmic horror or simply pretentious extremity remains debated, but the attempt indicates cosmic horror's influence across artistic media. The question becomes, why does cosmic horror translate successfully into interactive media, but struggle in passive media like film? The answer suggests something about the horror's essential nature. Passive viewing allows psychological distance. You're observing someone else's encounter with forbidden knowledge. Gaming collapses that distance. You're the investigator, making the choices, pursuing the knowledge. When your character goes mad from accumulated insight, you feel complicit in ways film cannot achieve. The tragedy isn't happening to someone else. It's happening because of you, through your choices to investigate, to open the door, to read the book. Interactive media makes the audience responsible for their own corruption, which is precisely what cosmic horror always implied. The choice to know is itself the transgression. Chaos magic practitioners adopted Lovecraft's entities with startling literalism beginning in the 1980s. But, with a critical philosophical distinction, they treated the entities as thought forms or egregores, rather than objective beings. Peter Carroll and Phil Hine, prominent chaos magic theorists, argued that magical effectiveness doesn't depend on entities' objective existence, but on their psychological utility. Cthulhu works magically, not because he's cosmically real, but because the cultural resonance and detailed mythology surrounding him make him a potent focus for altered states of consciousness. This approach seemingly neutralizes Lovecraft's horror. If you're consciously creating the entity through belief, it's not genuinely threatening. Yet practitioners report genuinely disturbing experiences working with Lovecraftian entities, suggesting that distinction between made up and real becomes meaningless once psychological effects manifest. Kenneth Grant's Typhonian order represents more disturbing appropriation. Grant, who studied under Aleister Crowley, argued in The Magical Revival, 1972, and subsequent works that Lovecraft was an unconscious channel for genuine occult knowledge. Grant proposed that Lovecraft's fiction described actual entities and dimensions he accessed through dreams, that the Necronomicon reflected real pre-human traditions, and that Lovecraft's materialist atheism was defensive rationalization against truths he accessed but couldn't consciously accept. This reading treats cosmic horror as revelation rather than invention, positioning Lovecraft as prophetic rather than creative. Grant's work circulates in genuine occult communities, not as fringe theory, but as serious magical philosophy, influencing practitioners who perform rituals based on Lovecraft's revelations. Academic Lovecraft studies emerged more slowly, but with increasing sophistication. S.T. Joshi's massive biography, H.P. Lovecraft, A Life, 1996, established the scholarly infrastructure for serious engagement, providing textual history, philosophical context, and critical analysis. Joshi approached Lovecraft as a significant American writer whose atheistic materialism and literary innovations deserved serious consideration alongside better-known modernists. This academic legitimization allowed university press publications, conference panels, and journal articles treating cosmic horror as philosophically substantive rather than pulp ephemera. The scholarly apparatus Lovecraft invented for his fiction now exists for examining his work. Bibliographies, textual variants, influence studies, philosophical exegeses. Philosophy departments discovered Lovecraft through Graham Harmon's Weird Realism, Lovecraft and Philosophy, 2012, which argued that Lovecraft's fiction anticipates object-oriented ontology. Harmon contends that Lovecraft's entities resist human comprehension because they possess inherent reality independent of human perception. They're not monsters, but objects that exist autonomously. This philosophical reading treats cosmic horror as ontological insight rather than psychological terror. Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, analyzed cosmic horror through the lens of the world without us, the planet's indifference to human existence. These philosophical appropriations take Lovecraft's implications seriously as metaphysical claims, not just as narrative devices. Political readings of cosmic horror proliferate across the spectrum, often contradictorily. The alt-right adopted Lovecraft, despite his racism being antiquated, even by 1920s standards, finding in his xenophobia and fear of miscegenation justification for contemporary white nationalism. They ignore that Lovecraft's horror derives from human insignificance. White supremacy is incompatible with cosmic indifference. Leftist readings, particularly Mark Fisher's capitalist realism, employ cosmic horror to describe late capitalism's totalizing logic. Fisher argued in The Weird and the Eerie, 2016, that cosmic horror captures the experience of living under systems too vast to comprehend, too entrenched to escape, and fundamentally indifferent to human values. Capitalism becomes Azathoth, mindless, unkillable, eternally churning. China Mieville represents revolutionary weird fiction that engages Lovecraft critically. His novel, The City in the City, 2009, uses cosmic horror's estrangement techniques to explore political rather than cosmic themes. Two cities occupying the same geographical space. Citizens trained to unsee the other city, reality enforced through social conditioning rather than metaphysics. Perdido Street Station, 2000, creates cosmic horror that's explicitly socialist, exploring how capitalism commodifies even the monstrous. Mieville demonstrates that cosmic horror's techniques, defamiliarization, ontological instability, indifferent forces crushing individuals, can be redirected from cosmic to political critique. The horror isn't that the universe doesn't care, it's that systems we created don't care either. Meme culture absorbed Cthulhu into internet vernacular with fascinating results. Cthulhu for President, Why Vote for a Lesser Evil became darkly humorous political commentary. The octopus head silhouette appears endlessly in digital art, often stripped of horrific context and rendered cute or comedic. This domestication seemingly defangs cosmic horror, but perhaps illustrates something deeper: the human capacity to normalize anything through repetition and humor. We cope with existential dread through memes, transforming the unthinkable into shareable content. Whether this represents psychological resilience or collective denial remains ambiguous. The SCP Foundation represents cosmic horror's most successful contemporary evolution, collaborative online fiction using institutional bureaucratic language to describe anomalies requiring containment. Thousands of writers contribute special containment procedures, documents describing objects, entities, and phenomena that violate natural law. The best entries use clinical language to describe horrifying implications. SCP-2D718 is a document describing what happens after death, information so disturbing that Foundation personnel who learn it must be terminated to prevent psychological contamination. The SCP format teaches cosmic horror's techniques to new generations: pseudo-documentary structure, implied rather than explicit horror, the suggestion that knowledge itself requires institutional containment. The foundation has become self-sustaining mythology, proving that Lovecraft's methods can be systematized and taught without losing effectiveness. The wiki contains thousands of successful cosmic horror stories created by amateurs who learned the genre's grammar through reading and imitating previous entries. These appropriations, occult, academic, political, mimetic, reveal cosmic horror's remarkable adaptability. The same texts inspire magical practice, philosophical analysis, political critique, and internet jokes simultaneously. This suggests that Lovecraft accessed something genuinely archetypal. The anxiety about knowledge's dangers resonates across contexts because it addresses fundamental human questions about inquiry's limits and consciousness's fragility. Whether approached as revelation, metaphysics, capitalism critique, or entertainment, cosmic horror's core insight persists. Some knowledge might genuinely exceed our capacity to integrate it safely. The various appropriations don't contradict this insight. They demonstrate it by showing how many different frameworks can't quite contain or domesticate what Lovecraft articulated. The forbidden knowledge motif persists because contemporary life validates its central anxieties with increasing frequency. Information age society drowns in data while starving for understanding. We possess unprecedented access to knowledge, but declining capacity to process, verify, or integrate it meaningfully. Climate science tells us precisely how we're destroying planetary habitability, providing detailed projections of ecological collapse. This information should catalyze action, but often produces paralysis instead. The knowledge is too vast, too overwhelming, too demanding of sacrifices we cannot coordinate globally. We know, but knowing doesn't empower, it crushes. This is Lovecraftian forbidden knowledge operating in mundane registers, accurate information about trajectories we cannot alter, producing psychological responses that prevent effective response. Surveillance capitalism represents cosmic horror's commercial manifestation. Corporations accumulate comprehensive behavioral data, building predictive models that understand our desires and vulnerabilities better than we understand ourselves. They know what will click before we click it, what we'll buy before we want it, how we'll vote before we've decided. This knowledge exists, operates continuously, shapes our reality through algorithmic recommendation and targeted manipulation, yet remains fundamentally inaccessible to us. We cannot know what they know about us. We cannot audit the models or understand the predictions. We exist as subjects of knowledge systems we cannot access, evaluate, or escape, exactly the position Lovecraft's protagonists occupy relative to cosmic entities. The horror isn't hypothetical, it's operational. Artificial intelligence escalates these anxieties toward genuine crisis. Machine learning systems now identify patterns human researchers cannot perceive, make predictions we cannot explain, and operate according to logic we cannot audit. Deep learning neural networks are black boxes even to their creators. Inputs and outputs are visible, but the intermediate reasoning remains opaque. As AI systems become more sophisticated, they're developing knowledge that humans not only don't possess, but potentially cannot possess because human cognition lacks necessary architecture. This creates the Lovecraftian scenario literally. Intelligences that understand reality more accurately than we can, operating according to principles we cannot learn because our consciousness is inadequately structured. The gap between human and artificial intelligence might be qualitative rather than quantitative, meaning certain knowledge domains may be permanently inaccessible to biological minds. Quantum mechanics and cosmology provide empirical validation of cosmic horror's metaphysical claims. observer effects demonstrate that measurement changes outcomes. The universe behaves differently when observed, suggesting reality is participatory rather than objective. Many worlds' interpretation proposes that all possible quantum outcomes occur, branching into parallel realities continuously. We exist in one branch while infinite other versions of ourselves exist in other branches, experiencing every possible variation. This is epistemologically destabilizing. Your decisions don't determine which outcome occurs, but rather which branch you consciously experience, while all alternatives occur equally. Consciousness becomes arbitrary passenger on one path among infinite paths, with no privileged access to overall structure. Cosmological discoveries keep confirming human insignificance empirically. The universe is 13.8 billion years old and will persist for trillions more. Earth will be consumed when the sun becomes a red giant in 5 billion years. The heat death of the universe, maximum entropy, absolute stillness, is inevitable and unpreventable. These aren't speculations or metaphors. They're established physics. Lovecraft's cosmic indifference is literally true. The universe doesn't care about human consciousness because the universe doesn't care about anything. Physical law is indifferent by definition. We're chemical accidents on an unremarkable planet that will end regardless of what we do. This knowledge should be impossible to live with. Yet we live with it by, mostly, not thinking about it, which is exactly the protective ignorance cosmic horror describes. Neuroscience dismantles consciousness itself as coherent concept. Research suggests free will is epiphenomenal. Decisions occur neurologically before conscious awareness, meaning you don't make choices, but rather witness choices your brain already made. The unified self is illusion. Consciousness is discontinuous, constructed retroactively through narrative, maintained through memory editing and selective attention. What you experience as you is post hoc rationalization of processes you don't control or understand. This is identity horror. You're not the author of your thoughts, not the decision maker in your life, not even reliably the same entity from moment to moment. Materialism proves correct, but materialist consciousness cannot accommodate its own material basis without existential vertigo. The ethical dimension deserves final consideration. Should some knowledge remain undiscovered? Science's foundational ethos assumes inquiry is inherently valuable, that expanding knowledge is always justified. But information hazards, ideas that harm through comprehension, genuinely exist. Rocco's basilisk, a thought experiment in decision theory, supposedly constitutes an information hazard. Understanding it places you at risk from hypothetical future AI. Whether this is legitimate concern or elaborate intellectual hazing is debated, but serious theorists take it seriously enough to argue about whether discussing it publicly is ethical. This suggests contemporary intellectuals recognize what cosmic horror articulated fictionally. Some ideas might genuinely be better left unthought. Climate science presents the most pressing instance. We possess detailed knowledge about planetary destruction we're causing, but lack psychological or political capacity to respond adequately. The knowledge produces despair, denial, or paralysis rather than coordinated action. Perhaps this is forbidden knowledge's real contemporary form. Accurate information about trajectories we cannot alter, creating psychological states that prevent response. We're trapped between ignorance and unbearable knowing, exactly where Lovecraft positioned his protagonists. The scientist who genuinely integrates climate science, not abstractly but viscerally, experiences something approaching cosmic horror. Awareness that the biosphere that enables your existence is collapsing, that collective action remains politically impossible, that your own consumption contributes to destruction, and that future generations will suffer consequences of decisions already made. The final implication is that cosmic horror wasn't speculative fiction, but diagnostic philosophy. Lovecraft identified something real. Consciousness has limits. Reality exceeds our comprehension. Certain truths are incompatible with psychological stability, and inquiry can proceed beyond the point where understanding remains beneficial. We're provincial intelligences who function optimally within narrow parameters. Beyond those parameters lies knowledge that doesn't empower or enlighten, but unmakes. The tragedy is that the intelligence capable of recognizing these limits cannot restrain itself from exceeding them. We're built to seek knowledge regardless of cost. The taboos against forbidden knowledge weren't oppressive superstition. They were protective wisdom, recognizing that consciousness is fragile, that reality is hostile to comprehension, and that not all questions should be answered. Lovecraft's horror endures because we keep validating it. Through technology we cannot control, knowledge we cannot integrate, and futures we cannot prevent, despite understanding exactly how they'll unfold. The cosmic horror was always here. We're just finally sophisticated enough to perceive it clearly.